This is Isaac Hale's home in Harmony, Pennsylvania. This is where Emma Hale grew up and where Joseph and Emma relocated to at the end of 1827. Just across the road is a little cottage where Isaac Hale moved Emma and Joseph into as they were preparing to receive their first baby. This was a massive deal for Joseph because up until this point he'd never had his own home, and it's a big deal for the couple because now they had incredible privacy. Joseph must have felt like he had made it. He has his own little farmlet, his own house, he's got a wife, he's got a child on the way. This is looking pretty sweet. And it's all happened because he's had to flee Palmyra because the persecution around the gold plates has just got too much. And he's managed to find Martin Harris, who's lent him or given him $50, and he's been able to utilize that in order to move. The Book of Mormon has a number of these Exodus narratives where a prophet has been warned and leaves and gets to a new promised land. After Lehi gives his blessing and dies, Nephi is warned to take those who want to go with him and depart into the wilderness. And we don't know much about this departure because it's in the replacement text and it doesn't have very many details. But we do know that this departure is not quite good enough because it happens again with one of the lines of Nephi, and that is with a king called Mosiah. We know about this because this is recounted by Amaleki in the Book of Mosiah, which is right at the end of the replacement text as it dovetails into the text, which is Mosiah. And Mosiah 1 verse 12 talks about this King Mosiah who is warned in a dream that they should flee out of the land of Nephi and basically come down to what is then called Zarahemla. Now this story was probably told in depth in the original manuscript, but we just don't have it. We only have a summary of it. But it's very curious that it seems to relate a lot to the ways in which Joseph moved from Palmyra right through to Harmony, Pennsylvania. Here I've put a selection of Joseph Smith's history, his 1838 version, and Mosiah chapter 1 side by side, and highlighted some themes which are similar between the two ideas. So Amaleki tells the story of how King Mosiah is warned and takes his people to a land called Zarahemla. Zarahemla already has people in it. We learn later in the book of Helaman that these people are descendants of Mulek, and so they're called Mulekites. They've come as a separate migration to the New World. They've been led out of Jerusalem and crossed the great waters, and they have been placed in this land. But they haven't brought any records with them, so their language is corrupt. King Mosiah has the sacred records with him, and so he's able to teach the people his language, give them the opportunity to engage with the text of the brass plates, and therefore they are rejoined to their faith and unite with King Mosiah and his people. And even though they're more numerous, King Mosiah is designated to be the new king of this combined nation. The people of Zarahemla also have a stone which has writing on it, and King Mosiah is able to interpret that writing because he's got this special gift. So I think Joseph has used the events in his own life to furnish this story because he similarly has come from a different place. He's been persecuted, he's fled, he's come to a new land, Harmony, Pennsylvania. He's united with the Hale and the Lewis and maybe in the Stoll and the Knight families who are all in that area. They're numerous, and he is then able to bring records. He's got the plates, and the plates have the truth on it, the true Christianity, because the people in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and particularly the Hales and the Lewises, they have a corrupt form of Christianity. They're Methodists. And Joseph sees himself as the savior of these people. He's able to bring them the true word of God, and that because of that, he is elevated to be his own king in that land. He's able to take over the knowledge of the people. I know it's fanciful, it's a little bit, speculative, but it is an incredibly interesting parallel. In Joseph's version of the story, he is given land and space and becomes a king of this new people, and they all acquiesce to him. This is, of course, not what actually happens. He gets to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and they don't regard him at all. And in fact, they resent him because he's married Emma, who they love, but he's not really that reliable. And he wants to work on this spurious text that is, from their perspective, anti-Christian. But in Joseph's version of this Christian adventure story, he is the hero and he's saving the people around him. And his new kingdom is this land with his cottage on it and the nearby Hale's family home. So if Joseph in Harmony, Pennsylvania is King Mosiah in Zarahemla, what can we learn about the other kings in the Book of Mormon? There is a lot to understand here, and it's quite complex. So I'm going to have to break it down into chunks so that we can understand it. I'm going to tell a bit of an overview first, and then we're going to go back and have a look at details. Omni is the end of the replacement text, and it's there to harmonize between the replacement text and what Joseph has started writing at the very beginning in April of 1829, and that is Mosiah. The Book of Mosiah starts with a king called King Benjamin, who's apparently the son of this first king, Mosiah, and then King Benjamin goes on to have a son called Mosiah, which he confers the kingdom onto. I think both of these Mosiahs are actually Joseph, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. And we'll also come back to King Benjamin because he's important for another autobiographical reason. So at the end of the Book of Omni, Malachi also talks about a group of people that went from Zarahemla to try and claim their first inheritance of Lehi. And in doing so, they had some incredible big setbacks and people died. And then they came back and another group set out and went to the land of the first inheritance to reoccupy it. We learn early on in the Book of Mosiah that King Mosiah II wants to learn about these people who have gone to the land of Lehi because he hasn't heard anything from them. A leader called Ammon takes a group to go find, on behalf of King Mosiah, what's happened to these people. And he comes to the land of Lehi and he finds Limhi, who is this king who is now in charge. But King Limhi recounts the understanding of his grandfather and father and how the people of Nephi have inhabited the land and what has happened to them. So in Mosiah chapter 9, we get a backstory, and that is the story of King Zeniff, who is one of these zealous men who goes to the land of the first inheritance in order to occupy it. And he meets the Lamanites who are occupying the land and makes a treaty with them. So we then have an account of the reign of King Zeniff, then his son King Noah, then his son King Limhi, and then the people escape that land and come back to Zarahemla. We're going to go through this in detail, but let me first give you an overview of these three kings. And I want to relate them to the Smith household. Because when you go and have a look at Lucy Mack's history in 1845, she spells out what's happening to the household in Palmyra, Manchester, as the family get established in the area and seek to establish a farm and a house. And I've done a bit of a side-by-side with excerpts from Lucy Mack Smith's history and also the chapters of Mosiah 9 with King Zeniff, Mosiah 11 with King Noah, and then Mosiah 19 with King Limhi. When I do a side-by-side with Lucy's history about the Smith family mortgage, and I put that side-by-side with the kings in Mosiah, this story seems to be very, very similar. Lucy recounts that Alvin is really in charge of the family at this point when they move through to Western New York, because Joseph Smith has lost the family fortune and he's not very reliable. Alvin, though, is extremely reliable, and together with his father and his brothers, they establish a farm on 100 acres. They have to take out a mortgage and there's a land agent, but they need to make payments yearly, and the first payment goes okay. The second payment is a little tough, and Alvin has to go out and find the money, and he manages to work really hard and do so. But then Alvin dies, and in the process of Alvin's building, he's got some building materials together, and so they end up finishing the frame house, but this means they are short on the mortgage. However, unbeknownst to the Smiths, the land agent has actually died, and so doesn't come to collect on the mortgage, which is really fortuitous for them because they just don't have the money. But with Joseph Smith Sr. back in charge, the family just don't have the money, and Joseph Sr. is into more speculative stuff like money digging, and he's enlisting Joseph Smith Jr. in this endeavor. They go on this Harmony dig in 1825, and they're really just scratching a living. While the two Josephs are away, a new land agent is appointed, and there's a concern over the outstanding mortgage. Lucy says the builder of the original frame house wants to acquire the farm because he likes it, and therefore he petitions the land agent that the Smiths have abandoned the property and he will buy it outright. Lucy has to come up with a plan, and so she enlists the help of a neighbour. He enlists the help of a friend called Lemu Dery. Lemu Dery actually purchases the property kind of on behalf of the Smiths, but now he's the landowner and the Smiths are now tenants. This is all done with the help of Hyrum Smith, who is, because he's a man and Joseph Smith Sr. is not around, he is the one who's brokering the deal. As it happens, the Smiths can't pay back Lemu Dery, and eventually, a couple of years later, he evicts them from their house. They have to go live in the log cabin again, and this is a really big deal for the Smith family. This overview is mirrored with the kings in Mosiah. We have King Zeniff, who's very zealous, who establishes the kingdom, who fights the Lamanites off a couple of times. The wars are land disputes, and they are kind of like him fighting off creditors. After Zeniff dies, the next king, Noah, does a lot of building projects, puts the kingdom into debt and doesn't service all the right things. So when the Lamanites come again, the kingdom falls. Limhi is made tributary king. They can still have the land, but now the terms and conditions are even harder and the people are under bondage. Alvin, Joseph Smith Sr. and Hyrum are much like Zeniff, King Noah, and then King Limhi. And Limhi's advisor, Gideon, services much the same kind of idea and place that Lucy Mack does when she's trying to negotiate all these deals and save the family. So that's the overview. Now let us look at the specifics. There's a really interesting contradiction at the beginning of the Book of Mosiah. In chapter 6, King Benjamin dies and confers the kingdom on his son Mosiah. And one of the first things that Mosiah does is that he sends a group of people headed by a guy called Ammon to find the people who had left Zarahemla some time ago and find out how they were doing, because he was concerned about it and his people were wearying him with wanting to know what was going on with them. Ammon takes 16 people. They wander in the wilderness for 40 days, going up to the land of Lehi to find it. There they encounter King Limhi, who is under bondage to the Lamanites, who recounts that his father Noah and his grandfather Zeniff have been the people that have administered the land. One of Limhi's big concerns is that he sent out people to find the land of Zarahemla, and they've got lost in the land northward, but they've been able to find some gold plates, 24 gold plates, which he can't tell what they are or how to translate them. But Ammon tells King Limhi that there's a king in Zarahemla, whose name is King Mosiah, who has a gift, has these stones which enable him to interpret languages. And this renders him a seer, because with these stones he can transverse space and time and know things which are unknowable. And this brings King Limhi a lot of joy, and that these plates are going to be interpreted by King Mosiah, and these great mysteries are going to be unfolded to the people. Now, if you haven't already seen the parallel. You'll be able to tell that a King Mosiah is Joseph with seer stones, and these gold plates can be translated and interpreted. Well, then this is just a story about Joseph getting the gold plates. But there's a couple of layers to this, because this is at the beginning of Mosiah, and this is in probably April of 1829 that Joseph is dictating this, and he's likely dictating this to Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery has come from New York to assist Joseph, and he has a gift from God. He uses a divining rod to determine the will, and he wants to translate. This is also seen in Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph's revelations from God to Oliver on the subject suggests that Oliver can translate, and then subsequently it's taken away from him. And at the same time, this idea that seers are greater than prophets because they have these instruments, these divine instruments, seer stones, that enable them to be better, is a subtle way that Joseph can keep the dictation of the Book of Mormon to himself and relegate Oliver Cowdery to a scribe. This is reinforced in these Doctrine and Covenants revelations, but it's also reinforced in the text of the Book of Mormon at the same time. But there's a crazy little contradiction here. These seer stones are supposed to allow King Mosiah the ability to see things at a distance, to be able to discern things which can't be known, to understand what is going on. But at the beginning of Mosiah chapter 7, Mosiah has sent Ammon and this party to go find the people of Zeniff and what happened to them. Why can't King Mosiah look into his seer stones and see what is going on with these people at a distance? Because that's what seer stones are supposed to be able to do. There is no need for Ammon to go find Limhi, because Mosiah could find where he was, could check on how he's doing, and send a rescue party if necessary. This is because seer stones don't work. And they're only in this part of the story to bolster Joseph's dictation of the Book of Mormon to Oliver Cowdery. But this is something that Joseph is really concerned about, because this is 1829, and the Smith family in Palmyra are having a lot of trouble. They've been evicted from their home, and now they're living in the log cabin, and Joseph is worried about them. Sending Ammon to go visit and check on them is something that probably actually happened in real life, that somebody from the area, maybe it was Joseph Knight Sr., went up to Palmyra to see how the Smiths were doing. And we have a lovely little cross-reference for this in the historic record. This is the statement of Abigail Harris, who is the sister-in-law to Martin Harris, and she gave an account in 1834 that was published in Mormonism Unveiled. She talks about how she was connected to the Smiths and met Lucy Mack one day, and Lucy Mack was telling her about all of this great activity with regard to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, that it was going to be very special and it was going to make lots of money. Lucy Mack pressed Abigail Harris for a little bit of money so that Joseph could come check on them, because he was worried about them. Lucy promised Abigail that by the Spirit she would get fourfold for the amount of money that she gave to Lucy to enable Joseph to take the stagecoach and come visit the Smiths. Abigail cleverly said, "Look, if I had the money, I would give it to you. But doesn't Joseph have these seer stones that he can look in and see if you're okay? Why doesn't he use them? Why does he have to come by stagecoach?" Abigail knows exactly what we know and what we can confirm from the Book of Mosiah, and that is seer stones don't work. Joseph can't use his seer stones to see his family in Palmyra, just like Mosiah can't see the people of Zeniff through his seer stones. And this is a crazy story that seems to mirror kind of exactly what's happening in Joseph's life at the time, and the kinds of concerns that he has, and the ways that he's recounting his events in his life as a Christian adventure story. As talked about earlier, Joseph loved his older brother Alvin, and so if this is an autobiography, we expect to see Alvin in the text. And I gave you that example of Alvin's deathbed, which seems to mirror what Lehi's deathbed looks like in 2 Nephi chapter 1 through to chapter 4. But I think a better example of Alvin is actually in Mosiah 9 and 10, which tells the story about King Zeniff. Zeniff establishes a kingdom in the old inheritance of Lehi, and therefore he interacts with the Lamanites, and this goes through various battles, in which case, at the end, Alvin is victorious. He establishes the kingdom. The two chapters in the current Book of Mormon which describe this is chapter 9 and 10 of Mosiah. And I've already gone through and shown that these stories are crafted, that chapter 9 and chapter 10 are exactly the same story arc that is built into this understanding. But there are a few differences, and one of them is that there is an idea of a battle in the first instance, in the first chapter, and an even greater battle in the second instance. And there are some really lovely comparisons between the story of Zeniff and the understanding of Alvin that we particularly get from Lucy Mack Smith's history in 1845. You can stop the video and see the side-by-side where I've put verses from Mosiah 9 and 10 against statements from Lucy Mack's history in 1845. What you notice first off is that Zeniff is described as being overzealous to inhabit the land of Lehi and gain his inheritance. And Lucy describes Alvin as being particularly zealous too, with regard to Joseph and the records. There is an understanding in both the account of Zeniff that they had afflictions, and also with regard to Lucy that they were under a great deal of destitution. Zeniff makes a deal with the Lamanites in order to possess the land and then builds buildings. The Smith family decide what they need to do to tackle their circumstances, and they enter into a mortgage and they get a piece of land and they start to build on that land too. Zeniff tells about how it's not long into the land that they are then attacked by the Lamanites. And Lucy talks about how quickly the first payment on the mortgage comes around. Zeniff talks about how industrious their nation is and how the women work and toil and the men cultivate. And Lucy talks about how the men in her family end up making the family farm, and she does a lot of the work in the background with cloth and textiles. In Mosiah chapter 10, Zeniff talks about an even greater battle that they have to face with regard to the Lamanites and how they work tirelessly. He has to rally the troops, and it's a big deal, but they are victorious in the end, and it's a massive slaughter. And Lucy talks about how the second payment of the mortgage is due, and they haven't even quite finished the first payment, so it's a big deal. And Alvin goes abroad, leaves home, works hard, incredibly hard, and puts it in his entire charge to get the money that's needed to satisfy the mortgage. It is a massive sacrifice on Alvin's part. And then both Zeniff and Alvin die, leaving the kingdom to a new ruler. Now, on its own, this could be just a coincidence, and I hope that as I go through the next few videos, you can see the details in regard to the other people in the family, in the Smith family, who take over, including Joseph Smith Sr. and then Hyrum, but also how this parallels to King Noah and King Limhi. But I think as a Christian adventure story, this is really fascinating, and it's clever. The idea of fighting off your mortgage being the same as fighting the Lamanites, and how you can be a hero to your family, and how you can be a hero to your nation, and even then identifying that there are some issues. And we know from Lucy's writing, and even from Joseph Smith's writing later, that Alvin was really dear to their hearts. He was a foundational aspect, maybe even a calming aspect in the family, particularly as in the case of Joseph Smith Sr. not being quite capable to run this. The idea that Alvin was in charge is a really big deal, and we'll discuss Noah or Joseph Smith Sr. next. When Alvin died at the end of 1823, there was a leadership vacuum in the Smith household. Alvin, who was 25 years old at the time, was basically running the family. And Lucy Mack Smith was incredibly able, but she was a woman, and this was early 19th century America. Hyrum was a couple of years younger than Alvin, but not the leader that Alvin was. Then there was Sophronia and young Joseph, who was 17 or 18 years old at the time. He was just coming into his adulthood, and I think he had a lot of ambitions for being a leader of the family, and we kind of see that with the character of Nephi, but he still wasn't in that position yet. Hyrum was the benign older brother who is most likely embodied with Sam with regard to Lehi and Nephi. So this meant that Joseph Smith Sr. was back in charge, and he wasn't particularly great at it. He'd earlier lost the family fortune by speculating on jinxing. And now, according to his neighbours, he spent the majority of his time with regard to treasure digging. So when we take Mosiah chapter 11, which talks about Noah as being the next in line after Zeniff, we can find a number of comparisons between him and Joseph Smith Sr. Alvin's death had caused his mother and some of his siblings an opportunity to go to church, and so they joined the Presbyterian church. But Lucy tells the account that although Joseph Smith Sr. was supportive, he would not go. Mosiah 11 talks about Noah in this regard, that he gets rid of his father's priests and he puts his own priests in his stead, that he delves himself into whoredoms and all manner of wickedness. And this seems to be the accounts that Joseph's neighbours give of him also. Joseph Capron in 1833 talks about how the family is addicted to gross immoralities, and that they gather a gang around them who are interested in this money digging and all kinds of speculation. Noah is described as spending all of his time in riotous living and becoming a drunkard because he planted vineyards. And then, of course, the Lamanites are coming up on them, kind of nipping at their heels a bit. Joseph Capron says a similar thing about the Smiths, that they are all doing these fooleries and indulgences, and that they were daily harassed by creditors. Barton Stafford, another neighbour, talks about Joseph Smith Sr.'s drunkenness and how that permeated the whole of the family. And there is a number of accounts from the Smith neighbours who talk about them drinking in excess and intemperance. Noah engaged in a number of building projects, including large spacious buildings and a fine throne. And Lucy Mack talks about this time period where they are building and finishing the frame house and how it affords them a number of comforts. Lucy talks about how a new land agent, because the last land agent has died, is appointed, and they become then concerned about the fact that they need to make their final payment. We actually see this event in Mosiah chapter 10 when King Limhi dies, and then his son rules in his stead, and then becomes a lot more concerned about Alvin or Zeniff and the people and being able to overthrow them. It's possible that King Noah is a bit of a composite, but the idea that he embodies basically Joseph Smith Sr. during this time period is an interesting one, because this is in stark contrast to the understanding of Joseph Smith Sr. as Lehi back in 1st and 2nd Nephi, where Lehi is designated as this great righteous visionary person who's led them out of their homeland into a new world, a land of promise. But if you consider that Joseph is talking about his father after the death of Alvin and how the family is kind of in turmoil because of him, that there's a point after this that Joseph Smith Sr. repents and changes his ways. And so therefore Joseph can talk about him as a bit of a hero and a visionary later in the dictation process when he talks about Lehi as the family father and visionary and prophet. But when he's recounting this period of time when Alvin has died and the family is in chaos, therefore Joseph Smith Sr. is a bit of a villain because he's not helping the family procure. And of course, the family farm gets lost, just like the kingdom gets lost in Nephi-Lehi. Many of you will recognize this Arnold Freeberg depiction of Noah in his court that typifies these chapters from Mosiah 11 through to 19. I like how the artist has portrayed a jaguar sitting at the feet of King Noah, because jaguars are indigenous to the Americas. Of course, the Book of Mormon never talks about a jaguar. It talks about animals which are not indigenous to the Americas and excludes animals that are. But I digress. Here is King Noah on his throne, and we've just talked about how King Noah can be a representation of this terrible father figure, Joseph Smith Sr., in a particular time frame in Joseph's life. Noah is depicted as having got rid of his predecessor's righteous court of advisors and stacking this court with priests who are really just idolatrous and doing all kinds of iniquity. And one of his wicked priests is Alma, who becomes really important to the story going forward. I also talked about how neighborhood reports in Palmyra linked Joseph Smith Sr.'s treasure digging to a gang of unruly people who were not that great. And this included Joseph Smith Jr., who was often the lead seer. So when I'm looking at Noah's court and how he's arranged, this seems very much like how Joseph Smith Sr. is in Palmyra, Manchester area, and the kinds of ways that he's conducting himself and bringing and involving particularly Joseph Smith Jr. in these endeavors. And then we have Abinadi. Abinadi is a prophet who comes to tell Noah that he is wicked, to bring his court to account, and basically on behalf of the Lord tell them that they are wicked, they need to change and repent, or they will be destroyed. Now this smacks of all kinds of Old Testament prophets who go to kings to tell them of their riotous behavior and warn them of God's decrees. But it also could be related to Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Smith Jr. with regard to Isaac Hale. In 1825, Josiah Stoll enlisted the help of Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Smith Jr. to do a treasure dig in Harmony, Pennsylvania. They boarded with the Hale family, and Isaac Hale was actually a witness on the agreement that the money diggers had with Stoll and others with regard to the treasure and what they would do with it once they found it. Isaac Hale recounts this event in his 1832 statement and talks about how the money diggers come and stay with him and how Joseph particularly gives them lots of encouragement, and then it kind of all falls apart. And the idea that the older Joseph Sr. and the younger Joseph Jr. fight. He remembers that Joseph Smith Jr. was particularly insolent to his father. Now, we don't have a lot of details, so this is quite speculative. But if we take the understanding from Isaac Hale and we relate it to the court of Noah, maybe we can get some little crossovers that give us some understanding about what's happening. When Joseph Jr. goes to Harmony, Pennsylvania with his father on this treasure dig, I mean, he's probably been on many treasure digs so far, but none so far away from home, and to be able to be in a completely different environment under the Hales' homestead and seeing their interaction. The Hale family have a really nice home and a really nice daughter. And by all accounts, Isaac Hale's interaction with his family, and particularly his daughter Emma, was a really beautiful one, a loving one. And as a devout Methodist, they were deeply Christian. Contrast that with the Smith home. They are living in abject poverty. They're doing these kind of spurious digs. And I can imagine that Joseph Smith, as he looks around at the Hale family and the way that they're interacting, it is in stark contrast to his relationship with his own father. And although Isaac Hale is a witness to the agreement of these money diggers, he is not supportive. He does not believe that this is the case, especially when it comes to seer stones and hats. So I think in this 1825 dig, Joseph Smith Jr. looks at Isaac Hale and sees him as a righteous man, a Christian, and sees his own father as a bit of a tyrant. Now, Abinadi in the court of Noah does not regard Alma, but Alma certainly notices Abinadi. Alma also notices the contrast. He sees a prophet of God beaming with light and infused with Christian understanding, and wicked King Noah, who is a tyrant. Alma is converted by Abinadi's example and seeks to break from Noah. And this is the case with Joseph Smith Jr. When they get back to Palmyra, Joseph doesn't want to be in the area any longer. He leaves pretty soon after and goes to be with Josiah Stoll and Joseph Knight Sr. in Bainbridge and Colesville. Joseph Smith Jr. is his dad's lead seer, so this is a major loss to the Smith family in Palmyra. But Joseph doesn't want to be around his family. He doesn't want to be in his dad's treasure-digging gang, and so he leaves the area. Abinadi in the court of Noah is this pivotal experience of this prophet calling a king to account. It's mostly about a contrast between good and evil. Contrast that Alma feels and makes a big decision about, which happens to be exactly the same kind of decision that Joseph Smith Jr. does when he's comparing his own father to that of a righteous father like Isaac Hale. Noah's loss of the kingdom is described in Mosiah chapter 19, and it has some really striking resemblance to the account that Lucy Mack gives in 1845 about how the Smith family lost their farm. In the Mosiah account, there is a strong man named Gideon who fights against King Noah, who believes that he is evil and wicked and that he is somebody that needs to be deposed. Gideon is a fascinating character in the Book of Mormon because he doesn't make much sense, because of course those who are trying to depose kings or trying to fight against what's going on are seen to be enemies in other parts of the Book of Mormon, but here Gideon is a hero. Gideon is on the brink of striking down King Noah when he finds that the Lamanites are attacking the land. Noah flees the city and Gideon is left there basically to broker a deal. It seems that in this particular chapter that Limhi, the son of the king, is then set up as the tributary monarch. In subsequent chapters, you understand that Gideon is an advisor to the king and helps the king broker some important negotiations between the Lamanites and the people of Lehi Nephi. But there is a tenuous peace brokered at the end of Mosiah 19 where King Limhi is a tributary king, but the cost is huge. This peace comes at a high cost. They need to give up half their wealth and then half their income going forward. Lucy Mack's history describes the loss of the farm when Joseph Jr. and Joseph Sr. are away from home. Lucy relates that men come to tell her and Hyrum that they are now the new possessors and owners of the farm and that the Smiths need to get out. Lucy sends Hyrum to the land agent to find out what's going on, and the land agent says that he's got reports that the Smiths have abandoned the farm. So he sold the deed on to somebody else. Lucy is then expected to come up with the money to buy out the last payment to secure the farm, and she just can't do this. She doesn't have any money, and Joseph Smith Sr. is away, and even though they send a word to try and find him, they just can't find him. So Lucy ends up brokering a agreement with a local Quaker who gets somebody else to come in called Lemu Dery. And Mr. Durfee puts up the money to secure the farm, but now Lemu Dery is the owner and the Smiths are now tenants. This is a huge loss for the Smiths, and it seems to be on the back of Joseph Smith's speculative treasure digging, which has taken him away to Harmony, Pennsylvania. You can imagine that Lucy is incredibly angry, but she doesn't say so in her memoir. She's just sad. But in the Mosiah account, Gideon is incredibly angry with King Noah. And Lemu Dery allows the Smiths to stay on the farm, but they have to provide Samuel Smith as a servant for 6 months of that particular year. This is that same half-income tribute that you see in Mosiah chapter 19, being an effectual understanding of Samuel Smith being given 6 months out of the whole year to serve the Durfees. The parallels between the two losses are just so tight that it's hard to imagine that these are not the same story. And the understanding that Gideon is Lucy Mack Smith and Limhi is Hyrum Smith. And the Lamanites are the creditors surrounding the Smith family as they lose their family farm. In Mosiah chapter 20 and followed up in Mosiah chapter 23, there is a story about the daughters of the Lamanites who are dancing and who get abducted by the priests of Noah who have run away from the city of Lehi. There is a very similar abduction story in the Book of Judges, chapter 21, where the women were dancing and they're taken away by the tribe of Benjamin. I've actually done a side-by-side between Judges chapter 21 and Mosiah chapter 20, and you can see that there are common themes and also exactly common language between these two stories, which suggests that it's been used as a base for this particular understanding. But there is also an autobiographical event for Joseph Smith, because of course he married Emma Hale in January of 1827, and the two eloped because the Hale family did not like Joseph. And we have a number of understandings around this. Firstly, we have from Lucy Mack Smith the understanding that Joseph wanted to go back down to the area, down to around Harmony, Pennsylvania, because he was lonely after Alvin's death. And I've just talked about how he was trying to escape his father and the money digging. And he ended up boarding with Josiah Stoll and then Joseph Knight Sr. And they, during the time that he was in that area in 1826, he would go and visit Emma, who was close by in Harmony, Pennsylvania. Isaac Hale relates in his 1834 statement that Joseph would come to visit, asked for Emma as a bride. He refused because Joseph was a stranger and he didn't approve of Joseph or his activities, particularly his money digging, and the fact that he generally was a stranger, and that probably meant that he was not a Methodist. But that Joseph came one day when Isaac was out of town and he took away Emma and they got married, they eloped without Isaac's permission. Hale Lewis, who is Emma's cousin, relates in 1879 that this was a big deal to the family because Emma was greatly beloved, and when she eloped, or when Joseph stole her, this was a huge upset, and the idea that Joseph's life was in danger. And this is related in Mosiah chapter 20, where the Lamanites come warring after Limhi because of this event that their daughters have been abducted. Hale Lewis also says that this reconciliation between Emma and her parents and an acceptance, or a tacit acceptance, of Joseph was affected by Emma and her sister. Mosiah chapter 23 says that the Lamanites come across the priests of Noah and that they have compassion on them because the wives and the daughters plead for the safety of their husbands. Peter Ingersoll, who was a neighbor to the Smiths and who took Joseph and Emma to Harmony, Pennsylvania for that reconciliation, talks about how Isaac Hale talked to Joseph and gave him a great scolding for stealing his daughter, and that Joseph kind of repented and said, I will stop being a money digger, and that Isaac Hale suggested that they could come and live with them and he would help him get into a notable and suitable business. In Mosiah chapter 23, the Lamanites have such compassion over Amulon and the priests of Noah that they put them in charge of some of these, well, particularly Alma and his flock. So again, there's a number of parallels between these abduction or the stealing of the Lamanite daughters and what happened to Joseph and Emma and their reconciliation with the Hale family.